for our monthly What is Written study. I don't know how many questions we'll be able to address this morning, but all of the questions will relate in one way or another to our Lord's Passion, the last week of His life. And the first question that we want to address is this: was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Now, my guess is that you are immediately going to say, well, of course it was. And that is certainly the way the Synoptic Gospels portray the Last Supper. Open your New Testaments to Mark chapter 14. And I want to read a bit in Mark's account, beginning in verse 12. Mark says, "Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, His disciples said to Him, 'Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?'" Let me pause here and remind you that the Old Testament law instructed the Jews that on the 10th day of the first month, the month Nisan, lambs were to be selected. And on the 14th day of that month, the Passover lambs were to be killed. So notice that Mark tells us that on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they killed the Passover lamb. So that tells us that we're talking about, or Mark was talking about, the 14th day of Nisan. And so Jesus' disciples came to Him and they asked Him, when should we prepare the Passover? Now continue reading with me in verse 13. "And He sent out two of His disciples and said to them, 'Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us.' So His disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as He had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. In the evening, He came with the 12, and then Mark goes on to tell us about Jesus' prediction of the one who would betray Him. And so the Synoptic Gospels tell us that when evening had come, Jesus and His disciples ate the Passover. The Old Testament reveals that the Passover lamb, as I've already mentioned, was to be killed at twilight, literally in the Hebrew. That's between the two evenings. And the Passover meal was eaten at twilight. In Luke's account of this, Jesus says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. All of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe the Last Supper as a Passover meal. But some argue that that was just not the case. Turn in your New Testaments to John chapter 13. And notice what John tells us in verse 1 and 2. He says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that His hour had come, that He should depart from this world to the Father, having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And so here John says, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus ate a supper with his disciples that John does not explicitly identify as a Passover meal. Well, now then, if you'll go with me to the 18th chapter of John's Gospel, John tells us that the next morning, Jesus was delivered to Pilate early in the morning. Look at verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. So, think about what has transpired since the Last Supper. Jesus and his apostles leave the upper room. They make their way across the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prays that the cup might pass from him. Judas and his motley crew show up, and Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. He is arrested, and then he is taken to stand before Annas, a former high priest. And then he is taken to Caiaphas, and then he stands before the entire Sanhedrin. And then, and only then, is Jesus delivered to Pilate. Now I want you to notice that in verse 28, John tells us that those who brought Jesus to Pilate did not go into the praetorium lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Well, would that not suggest that they have not eaten the Passover? That is certainly what some argue. Well, in the 19th chapter of John's Gospel, we are told in the 14th verse that Pilate presented Jesus to the Jews about the 6th hour on the preparation day of the Passover. And then John tells us in verse 31 that Jesus was crucified on the preparation day before the Sabbath, which was a high day. That would have been the 15th of Nisan. Now, backing up in time, going back to John chapter 13, during the Last Supper, when Jesus urges Judas to go and do quickly what he was going to do, you'll recall that the apostles didn't know why Judas was leaving. And some of them thought that he had gone out to buy what they would need for the feast of Passover. Well, Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 27, verse 1, that the Sanhedrin condemned Jesus on the day of his crucifixion, and sources outside the Bible indicate that that would have been unlawful on the Sabbath or upon a great festival day. So, the synoptics certainly describe the Last Supper as a Passover. In Luke's account, he says in Luke 22:15, or quoting Jesus, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Then you've got John's account in John 18:28 that Jesus is taken to Pilate early in the morning But the Jews will not go into the praetorium lest they be defiled, so that they might eat the Passover. Now I ask you, if someone were to point these two passages out to you and say, well, now what about this? Luke indicates that Jesus ate the Passover. John indicates that the Jews had not yet eaten the Passover. I think this is an important question to consider because skeptics and critics of the Bible point to apparent discrepancies like this to argue that we do not have good, solid evidence for the resurrection. In other words, they say we can't trust the gospel accounts concerning the resurrection because you've got all of these contradictions in the record. Well, various harmonizations have been suggested. Some have argued that in the days of Jesus, different Jewish calendars were used by different segments of the Jewish population. The problem with that is that there's no explicit statement in the text that Jesus followed a different calendar than others. Another explanation is that in John chapter 18 and verse 28, when the Jews said they wouldn't go into the praetorium lest they be defiled so that they might eat the Passover, that the word Passover there is not referring to the Passover meal, the Seder meal, but rather the feast of unleavened bread. Now, I'll just tell you, I think that is the simplest and the easiest and the correct explanation. I'll come back to that in a moment. Again, you've got the Passover meal on the 14th of Nisan. And then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread from Nisan 15 through 21. And the chronicler tells us that during that feast, other meals were eaten by the Jews. I'm not going to take the time to turn to that passage, but if you're taking notes, I would urge you to jot that down. Some argue that John has deliberately rearranged the chronology according to John's theology, so that Jesus would die when the Passover lambs were killed. You'll recall that in John chapter 1 and verse 29, John the Baptist saw Jesus passing by, and he said to two disciples, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And so some argue that John deliberately changed the chronology for theological reasons. Well, I just don't think that's the case. First of all, I don't think John would do that, especially when truth is emphasized so strongly as it is in John's gospel. And then there are those who argue that the preparation day of the Passover merely refers to the Friday before the Sabbath. All right. Let's think for a moment about this term Passover. And there's clear indications that this term meant different things in different contexts. We read about killing the Passover in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 21. The record says, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover. And then in the New King James translation, the word lamb is italicized. And you know what that means. That it's not in the original Hebrew. It's been added by the translator, I think rightly so, to help us better understand. But it's obvious that in this passage, when we're talking about killing the Passover, what that means is killing the Passover lamb. That's what the word Passover means in this context. And then there are other passages that talk about eating the Passover. For example, in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 17, Matthew writes, now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? What are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the Passover meal. That's what the word Passover means in that passage and in others as well. And then there are several passages that talk about keeping the Passover. For example, in Numbers chapter 9 and verse 2, the text says, let the children of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. Well, now what's that talking about? Well, that's talking about the Passover feast, isn't it? In Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 18, Matthew says of Jesus, and he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand, I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Again, that's talking about the Passover feast. Now, it is certainly the case that in some passages there is a clear distinction made between the Passover on Nisan 14 and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that ran from Nisan 15 through 21. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5 and 6, the text says, on the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Obviously there, a distinction is made between the Passover on the 14th and the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th through the 21st. But then there are passages where the term Passover is applied to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 21, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall observe the Passover. Now listen carefully to what he says next. A feast of 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. Obviously, he's applying the term Passover to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then in Luke chapter 22 and verse 1, Luke says, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called Passover. That's not all that surprising to me, that two Jewish feasts that come back to back would be referred to by the single term Passover. And so I think that's what's going on in John 18:28 when the Jewish leaders refused to go into the praetorium lest they be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. I think what they mean is that they would be unable to eat some of the other meals associated with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now let's talk about the preparation day a little bit. In Mark chapter 15 and verse 42, Mark says, "Now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath." Well, that would be what day of the week? That would be Friday, of course. In John chapter 19 and verse 14, John says, "Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king." In Luke chapter 23 and verse 54, Luke says, "That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near." Obviously, this is talking about Friday before the Sabbath on Saturday. And then in John 19:31, John says, "Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath," for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Obviously, Jesus is crucified on the preparation day, and they broke the legs of the two criminals to hasten their death so that they would die before the Sabbath arrived that evening, approximately 6 p.m. Then in John 19:42, John says, "So there they laid Jesus," that would be Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, "because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby." Then Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 62, "On the next day," this is the next day after the crucifixion, "which followed the day of preparation," so we're talking about the Sabbath, "the Jewish leaders go to Pilate and they request a guard to guard the tomb." So clearly there is indication in Mark and Luke and in John that the preparation day was the day before the Sabbath. But then you've got that phrase in John 19:14, "the day before the preparation of the Passover." But I really don't think this is all that difficult. Because I think this phrase, "the day before the preparation of the Passover," simply means the day before the Sabbath during the Passover festival. And so we really don't have a problem here. So, to recap, I believe the simplest, easiest explanation is that the Jews refused to go into the praetorium lest they be defiled so that they could eat the Passover. They weren't talking about the Passover meal, but rather the Passover feast and various meals associated with that. Well, here's another question associated with Jesus' passion, and that is, how many times was Jesus scourged? In John's Gospel, John describes one scourging before Jesus was sentenced. Begin reading with me in John 19, verse 1. "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. So John describes one scourging before Jesus is finally sentenced and delivered over for crucifixion. But go to Matthew chapter 27 and begin reading with me in verse 26. Matthew says of Pilate, "Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." So Matthew and Mark and Luke describe a scourging by Pilate just before he's delivered to be crucified. Well, there's two possible explanations here. And that is that there were, in fact, two different scourgings. The first, described by John in John 19, verse 1, would have been less severe. The second, described by the Synoptic Gospels, would have been a very brutal beating. On the other hand, it may be that there was only one scourging. Mentioned earlier by John in his account, mentioned later in their accounts, by Matthew and Mark. One scourging is the majority view, which doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it is the majority view. I think that's probably the case. And basically what we have Matthew and Mark doing is summarizing events without mentioning Pilate's repeated attempts to release Jesus. But John gives us a more detailed chronology. And so Matthew and Mark simply mention the scourging at the point where Jesus is finally delivered for crucifixion without intending to specify its exact chronological placement. So in other words, they mention a scourging right before Jesus is delivered, but that would have occurred earlier where John places it in his gospel. And so the sequence would be something like this. Pilate interrogates Jesus. Jesus is scourged. The soldiers mock him. That's when they put the purple robe on his back, the crown of thorns on his head. Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, saying, "Behold your king." The Jewish leaders continue demanding his crucifixion. And then Pilate finally hands Jesus over. Now, if there were two scourgings, and that is a minority view, as I've already said, John 19:1 would describe the first scourging. It would have been a lighter judicial flogging intended to satisfy the crowd. Pilate is hoping that with this punishment he'll be able to release Jesus. And then the second scourging would have occurred where Matthew and Mark place it. And it would be the severe Roman scourging that normally preceded crucifixion, administered after Pilate officially sentenced Jesus. What's the arguments for this view? Well, number one, John's chronology seems very deliberate. Luke records Pilate saying, "I will punish him and release him." Some argue suggesting an earlier punishment. Roman governors sometimes administered lesser beatings before final sentencing. No gospel explicitly says Jesus was scourged twice. Okay, here are arguments against that view. Matthew and Mark use language naturally referring to the well-known pre-crucifixion scourging. And as I'm sure you've heard preachers say on other occasions, a Roman scourging was extraordinarily brutal. Surviving two scourgings like that would have been very unusual. And it's just simply the case that ancient writers often summarized events without strict chronological precision. So, while I'm not sure that we can rule out two scourgings, I think it's more likely that Jesus was only scourged once, and that would have occurred where John places it in his account. And then Matthew and Mark just quickly mention that it had occurred right before they say Jesus was delivered for crucifixion. Again, I do think it is important for us to consider questions like this because skeptics and critics of the Bible bring these things up to try to argue, well, we just can't trust the gospel accounts of the resurrection because there's all these contradictions in their accounts. Well, I hope I've shown you that there are not contradictions, at least in the two questions that we've had time to address this morning. But I remember, I think this was maybe 1984, I attended a debate in Louisville, Kentucky between Brother Tom Moody and Frank somebody, Lovell maybe, I forget his last name, an atheist. And they were debating the existence of God. And in the second night of the debate, Tom argued that God exists because Jesus said he existed and Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, Frank Lovell was not prepared for that line of argumentation, and really the only thing that he offered, well, we can't trust the gospel accounts because of all these contradictions. And so I think we need to recognize that there are some difficulties. There are some things that maybe look on the surface to be apparently contradictory, but when you dig in a little bit, simple, plausible explanations are available. Thank you for your very kind attention.